And then we can go to the beginning. Right, and now we're ready to go. Room is more or less ready for us to begin. So welcome, as always, to the Maritime History seminars organised by the British Commission for Maritime History, of course, but with the support of the Society for Nautical Research and Lloyd's Register, and of course your hosts, the Walton Naval History Unit, the Sir Michael Howard Centre for the History of War, and the Department of War Studies, and all the rest. You're all very welcome here. And pleasure to introduce Mary Shannon tonight. Delighted she agreed to come and speak to us. Mary's a writer, a senior lecturer at Roehampton, and an expert on all things print culture and Regency and Victorian Britain. I think it's fair to say, award-winning author and author of a very recent book. A recent book for which there's some promotional material here on Billy Waters, which is what we're going to hear about tonight. And so it's with thanks that I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Oh, by all means. Thank you. Far be it for me to stop applause. I mean, thanks, Alan. Thanks for inviting me to speak tonight and for hosting and organising all of this and smuggling in wine and glasses. And thank you to everyone for coming, those of you in the room and those of you online. It's a great pleasure to see and be aware of you all here tonight. Thanks for venturing out in the cold or giving up part of your evening to listen to the tale of Billy Waters. And also my search for him, and what that tells us about the experiences, the world of black sailors in the Regency Navy. This is all based material from my book. Here it is. Here's the copy. And there is Billy Waters on the front cover. I'm going to show you lots of images of Billy Waters. I don't know if you can see it on screen. I'm going to show you lots of images of Billy Waters. Most of the ones I'm going to show you are very racialized, they're very caricatured. So, you know, be aware of that. But this is the most common image of him that tends to turn up in modern accounts of Billy Waters' life. And that's why I put it on the book. But it has some problems as a representation of Waters, the disabled sailor that I'll tell you about. So I want to talk to you about my search for Billy Waters, why I engaged in that search, why I felt it mattered, why I got so interested in this person, and what the conclusions that I drew from that, or what I learned from that search about the experiences of black sailors in the Regency Navy. So I first got interested in Billy Waters when I first joined the University of Roehampton. This is slightly grainy image of our campus. It's in southwest London, for those of you who know it. And I just joined there as a postdoctoral research fellow. And a colleague of mine, a senior colleague of mine, said to me, "Oh, you're interested in the history of London. You're interested in 19th century print culture and the popular representations of London life in the early part of the 19th century. You should go and read this book called Life in London." So I went to the British Library and I looked up Life in London, which it turned out, as I'm sure many of you know, it was written by a man called Piers Egan. He was an Irishman, actually, and famous as a sporting journalist. And he created this serial tale published in weekly parts called Life in London, which was not really a story, but was a narrative all about two young men, Tom and Jerry, and their sprees and larks around the city. So their adventures hunting for girls, booze, gambling, trouble of all kinds. And generally speaking, these two young guys find it. Trouble, that is. It was a hugely popular book, hugely. I mean, I don't think it's possible to exaggerate how popular Life in London was when it came out, serially published in 1820. 1820 to 1821, 21, it was serialized. They couldn't hand color the pictures fast enough. People were queuing outside the bookshops to get copies. It was all everybody talked about. All the kids wanted to speak in the flash slang that Tom and Jerry used. And one of the chief attractions, it seems, was the pictures. And, you know, me as a postdoc then in the British Library, I could well see why. The pictures were designed by the Cruikshank brothers, George and Robert. George, of course, went on to illustrate Oliver Twist. And they're hand-colored, as I say, so every copy is slightly different. And one of the pictures that caught my eye was this one. It's a pub scene in London, not too far from here. It's in Seven Dials. And I mean, there's a hell of a party going on. People are drinking, smoking, dancing, fighting, flirting. There's this incredibly lively scene. You can almost hear it. And right in the middle, almost like he's driving the action, is this figure, a black man playing the fiddle. He's got long white hair. He's wearing this extravagantly feathered bicorn hat. He appears to be wearing a blue sailor jacket. He's got one leg lifted as if he's dancing, and you can just about see the shaft of a prosthetic limb there. And the candlelight is sort of drawing our attention to him. It's almost like a space opens up in various. I mean, it's an incredibly diverse crowd, this pub crowd, but he stood out for me, especially because of that costume, of that hat and feather. And I thought to myself, who is that? Who is that? And what are they doing in a pub in Jane Austen's London? So I wanted to know more. And there began my quest for a man who I realized pretty quickly was known as Billy Waters. I found out that there was a certain amount of basic knowledge floating around about him. He is actually very local to here. So that pub scene the book was so popular, the book was turned into an adaptation very quickly. A musical extravaganza, we might now call it Life in London, the musical. The playwright, William Moncrief, called it Tom and Jerry. And it was a rip-off adaptation. It was unauthorized, but again, hugely popular. Moncrief boasted he could shut down the Strand at 3 PM because people were so desperate to get tickets to this show. And in the production, that illustration that I just showed you was turned into a key scene in the play. And Billy Waters is turned into a character in that scene, and he drives the energy of the scene and is depicted on stage as a fictionalized character. Meanwhile, it turns out the real historical Billy Waters was performing a few yards away around sort of Charing Cross, the Strand, all around Westminster actually, performing as a street performer. I'm not too different from the buskers of Covent Garden today. He created this elaborate street act where he sang, he danced, he had this incredible costume with the feathered bicorn hat, his sailor jacket, sailor trousers, and of course, his wooden leg, which by all accounts he used in his performances. He would kick it out in time for the music. He would deliberately play on the tradition of wooden legged dancers that was very popular from the 18th century onwards. And he had a hit song, Polly, Will You Marry Me? Which, had a kind of racy version, as more in the tradition of sailor songs, I suppose, and a politer version. So his street act was drawing crowds just down the road, while a fictionalized version of him was being played on the Adelphi stage. I found that out pretty quickly. Those basic facts were known. Added to that, it was known that it wasn't Billy Waters himself who performed as himself on the Adelphi stage. Of course, the Adelphi's still there. A later iteration of the Adelphi is still there today. It wasn't Billy Waters himself on the Adelphi stage. It was a white actor, able-bodied actor, performing Billy Waters in blackface. Added to that was problem number one with this adaptation for Waters. Problem number two was that the scene itself depicted Waters as a very aggressive, strong character. Yes, it gave him kind of power and agency in the scene, but it depicted him very much, as a bully. Somebody who was laughing at those foolish Londoners who gave him charity. Because actually, he's the king of the beggars. He's a carnivalesque figure. He didn't need Londoners' charity. He actually lived really well, according to this play. So the story went, I found out that Waters, his income dried up, and he died in poverty in the workhouse. That basic outline was known. I also found representations of him, pictures of him. So there he is in a print by a man called Thomas Lord Busby from 1819, performing his street performance, wearing his sailor jacket and his feathered hat. There were images of the actor, Signor Paolo, who was famous for performing Billy Waters, the character, in blackface. And there were figurines of Waters produced decades after his death. Cheap pottery, theatrical memorabilia, about sort of yay high, these are. Circulating and being, copied and reproduced actually all the way into the 20th century. But of course, clearly these are, one is a representation not of Waters at all, but the actor playing him. And those two are incredibly racialized and caricatured. Look at the figurine, especially. It's not a representation of an individual person, a living, breathing, historic person. It's a representation of an idea, a sort of blackface stereotype. And we might want to ask ourselves, what did people think of buying when they bought this? What were they purchasing here? So his fame initially came from these sort of representations in images, and they draw attention to that sailor jacket and that hat, which obviously immediately made me think of Napoleon's bicorn. And I found a few references to him in cheap print. This one on the left goes into a bit of detail about his life. It's actually the obituary of Billy Waters, which circulated in about 20 different London newspapers when he died. So that tells us that he was significant enough as a sort of a sight of London that people felt they knew about and wanted to see. He was significant enough to Londoners that the newspapers thought it worth devoting column images to this poor black disabled man. And here it tells us for the first time that he was indeed formerly a sailor, and he received a trifling pension since he left the service. And we also find out that he had a wife and children. So we're starting to get a picture of maybe why he is disabled, how he became disabled, and why the necessity to not just live on that pension, but to create a new career for himself as a street performer. He had mouths to feed. So that's a sort of very, very bare bones biography, if you like. And then there are other accounts here. So this is from collected by an antiquarian actually in the 1870s, but it's from a piece of cheap fiction which fictionalizes the scene in the play and sort of tells it like a prose narrative, and again emphasizes Billy Waters as this carnivalesque figure. Strong, bullying, aggressive even, laughing at people who give him money, living really well, and eventually losing his livelihood. So I had those bits of information. But that told me nothing about how Waters ended up in the Navy. Why, what was it like being a black sailor in the Regency Navy? What did Waters think about any of this? What was important to him about his naval experiences? What fed into his performances? What made him sad? What made him frightened? What did he look back at with fondness? In other words, how could you go from this sort of basically empty archive to something that's like, how's I going to do that? How's I going to give this person who was, you know, let's be honest, suffering from so many disadvantages in terms of being, you know, so many ways in which he was marginalized. He was poor, he was black, he was disabled at a time when those were downright dangerous things to be. How is I going to accord him the same kind of respect that we treat more powerful figures that we write biographies of? How's it going to do that? I didn't know, so I'd set it aside for a while. And then I came back to this problem, what I thought of for myself as the problem of the archive. And rather than sort of heading straight for the records of the Regency Navy that I knew were in the National Archives in Kew, I wanted to think through what was I doing, what was I going to do when I grappled with those archives? What was I going to do when I went hunting for Waters through the muster list, through the captain's logs, through the pension list, through the hospital records? How was I going to build a picture of someone's life when all you've got are teeny little traces? And I came up with, I found some models. I found some scholars who'd grappled with this problem before me. One of them is Imtiaz Habib, who wrote a great book called Black Lives in the English Archives. And he talks about what he calls the arc of invisibility. In other words, he frames the problem like this. He says, you know, if people are missing from the archive, they're not just absent. It's not just an annoying problem for the historian. They're actually erased from history. They are missing from our sense of the story, the shape of it. There's a hole in our analysis and our interpretation. What I found helpful to think through what you do once you've recognized that was Alan Corbin's approach, the famous historian of early modern France. He talks about, he writes a biography about a shoemaker where he literally just has the records of the guy's birth and death, municipal records, and that's it. And he writes a biography, he calls it an evocation of a life. There's a critic called Celia Hartman who's talked about critical fabulation and how you can use essentially educated best guesses to build up the shape of black lives from history when the facts are not just missing from the archive, but have been deliberately erased in many circumstances. And I also was interested by Marion Turner's book, her biography, if I can call it that, of the wife of Bath, Joyce's wife of Bath, which made me realize that characters as well can have a life and a biography. And made me think that actually the fictionalized version of Waters the ex-sailor was just as important in understanding ordinary sailors' experience in this period as the facts about Billy Waters, the ex-sailor. That representation was going to matter in this story, in other words. Yeah, all right, I will talk about that. The other problem that I had here was what I tend to call the Bridgerton problem. You may be familiar with this TV series, but when dealing with Black lives from the beginning of the 19th century, Bridgerton has done many wonderful things in terms of giving representation to giving roles for actors who've been traditionally excluded from costume drama, giving representation in costume drama for people who feel that they haven't had that. But it comes with two problems, doesn't it? It comes with the problem that if you create this beautiful, sugary fantasy world, it ignores the realities of history and empire. You know, it ignores the transatlantic slave trade. It ignores those impacts on people's lives. And secondly, by showing a diverse Regency world like this, it also suggests that that very diversity is a fantasy and can never actually be historically accurate. When, of course, the Regency Navy and Regency London as well was an incredibly diverse world. So how did I answer my problem? What I decided was that what I realized, I suppose, was that actually in tracing the life of William Waters, the sailor, Billy Waters, the fictional character that he creates himself, the performance identity that he develops, was important too. That I needed to think about the man and the character, and both of these things were a way into the world of sailor experiences. So I decided I was going to unpick the parts of his costume. That actually in his costume, that's where Waters was making choices. That's where Waters was bringing together the various influences in his transatlantic, circumatlantic life. And that's where we don't have papers, we don't have diaries, we don't have letters for him, but we do have that. And so I thought, right, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to unpick the parts of his costume, unpick his the influences on his music and his performance, and set him in the context of lives that shaped his performance and were shaped by his performance. And so I organized the whole project by the parts of the costume: hat, sailor jacket, wooden leg. I can call that costume. It was a necessity as well, but he certainly, I'm arguing, used it in his performances as costume, like the fiddle and his wig. So, to give you an example of what I mean by that, I want to spend the rest of this time talking about sailor jackets. And make a case to you that Billy Waters' sailor jacket gives us a window into a circumatlantic musical life and into a sort of ground level view of Black sailors in the Regency Navy. Armed with that obituary and the clue that Waters had been in the Navy, I went hunting through the National Archives. And to cut a long story short, I found a muster list entry for William Waters. There he is, down the bottom. William Waters, 35, that's probably just shorthand for mid-30s, but you know, yeah, more or less, they gave me a starting point. Able seaman from New York. When I found that, that was a good day. Suddenly, I had a whole heap of information about William Waters that I didn't have before. So that gives us a birthplace starting point. New York. Judging by the other entries in that particular muster, my guesstimate was that that's New York City rather than New York State. And that fits with the other entries because this particular ship, HMS Namur, it was a guard ship just off the Nore. It was a receiving ship for new recruits. And this is an incredibly multicultural crew list, or kind of stock list, I suppose you could call it. The hands, the men who've been mostly pressed, sometimes listed as volunteers, sitting on this guard ship, waiting to be transferred out to the fleet, which is hungry. It's 1812, it's 1811, and the fleet is hungry for manpower. So we've got an incredibly diverse crew from all around the globe, actually. Lots of Swedish, lots of Italian, lots of Americans, the odd man from the Caribbean, and all around British Isles. Also, what interested me was he enters British Navy as a naval seaman. So that immediately tells us that he was an extremely experienced sailor the moment already by the time he steps on board the deck of a British ship. That probably doesn't surprise us because 1811 is of course just before the 1812 war with America. So right at this point, British ships are busy impressing American seamen, and especially experienced ones. So that would be an extremely likely reason for Waters to end up on the deck of a British ship, right, in late 1811. And so, thinking about that sailor jacket, suddenly we've got somebody who is not just experiencing the wooden world of the British Navy, but has already spent a considerable career at sea. Has picked up, we can't say for sure, but at least 5 years. He must have been at sea, deep sea, for at least 5 years by this point. He would have picked up his musical influences from around not just Black cultures in America, but Caribbean cultures influencing New York cultures, Dutch America, and then the huge cultural melting pot that is the British man of war or the US merchant marine. Of course, it was always important to have a fiddler on board ship to exercise the men as well as provide entertainment. And it was a good way to get a job at sea. So suddenly we've got reasons for, why a young Black man might see entry into a maritime life as a way to get a certain amount of freedom and agency that would be denied on shore. Obviously, the Navy was no unracialized idyll, but nevertheless, in the Navy, you're valued for your skills. And we can see that because very quickly, on this master list, we see very quickly he was promoted, Waters was, to quarter gunner. Quarter gunner is, of course, a responsible position on a Navy ship. There's one quarter gunner for every 4 guns. They're responsible, they're on the gunner's team. They're a highly skilled petty officer, a member of an elite part of the crew. This tells us not just something about Waters personally, that he was clearly a very intelligent and valued member of the crew, but tells us something about the meritocracy that was below decks in the Navy. Interestingly, there are quite a few of the able seamen were promoted to quarter gunner at the same time as Waters, and it's possible one of the other quarter gunners was definitely an American, and possibly may have been a Black man as well. So in wearing that sailor jacket, then I would suggest that Waters is making a deliberate link to the Jack Tar stereotype. He's deliberately framing himself as just as much a valuable, important part of that narrative of British maritime success and the romantic stereotype of Jack Tar and his lass, as any white sailor might be. And then we've got the connections back to New York. So not just is Waters positioning himself with that sailor jacket as Jack Tar, as a sort of emblem of Britishness in this maritime period in the Napoleonic Wars, but with that hat that might make us think of Napoleon. Perhaps it's a satirical dig at Britain's greatest enemy at this point. Perhaps it's also a link back to his New York origins. This is an account of a figure called the Pinkster King. There were Pinkster festivals in New York that Black communities and poor white communities participated in. They took place at Pentecost. They were all about music and dancing, feathered costumes, and they were led by somebody called the Pinkster King. And the Pinkster King wore an extravagant costume, including not a bicorn hat, but a tricorn hat, trimmed, feathered. So that combination of jacket and hat is pulling on officer dress, sailor dress, stereotypes of Jack Tar, mocking caricatures of Napoleon, but also showing a bigger kind of transatlantic circulation of popular culture that Waters was part of, knew about, and was commenting on really by in the way he put his performance together. Because that depiction of the Pinkster King with his tri-cornered cocked hat trimmed with lace of gold made me think of Waters. And also the Pinkster King wore a military uniform and a kind of mockery of British uniforms. And it made me think of Waters' sailor jacket. So with that reference in the mustard list to New York, to being an able seaman, we see Waters and linking that to his costume. We see him setting himself up as a sort of as Jack Tar, but also a transatlantic figure, emerging really, I suppose, of different maritime influences. And then with that reference to him being a quarter gunner, we get a window into as I was saying, the sort of the meritocracy of lower deck life in the Navy. This is not somebody who was the kind of comic buffoon of the stage stereotype. Experienced sailors were valued for their skill and valued themselves for their skill. Experienced sailors were supposed to set an example. They were supposed to behave in certain ways. There were standards about how Jack Tar was supposed to be in popular culture anyway, to kind of be admiring of female beauty, to be brave in danger, to be noble in the moment of ultimate sacrifice for their nation. And we see in these sketches of sailors raising a flag from round about the same year actually that Waters joined the Navy. We see a sort of depiction here of the ordinary sailor as skillful and athletic like a dancer. It's kind of elegance about these sketches. And in that promotion we see a world that Waters could access where, okay, it may be unlikely for him never to be captain of his ship. but his colour was no bar to being a petty officer. This image here is a caricature by a lieutenant in the Navy in 1812, and it shows a mess with 5 white sailors and a black sailor as part of the mess joining in together. Of course, a sailor's mess is a very intimate space. You could shift your mess if you really needed to, had to. To be part of a mess is to be accepted, to be brought into a community, to be valued, I suppose, is the way it's written about in popular culture. And here in this representation, we see a diverse group of sailors on equal terms together. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of a kind of, as I say, a post-racial idyll in the British Navy. But I certainly do want to point to the ways in which being a black sailor on a British naval ship was an extremely extraordinarily ordinary thing. And part of a general diverse group, and somewhere where somebody like Waters, who was quite possibly born into enslavement, could find opportunities that would be denied to him ashore. So final piece I went looking for then was that wooden leg. What happened to Waters? And what could that tell us about life for an ordinary sailor in the Regency Navy? Well, again, in the archives, at the National Archives, I found another tiny trace which gave me that window onto that world. In the captain's log for HMS Ganymede in 1812, there was this entry. AM, moderate breezes and cloudy, loosed sails. We're in the Bay of Cadiz, by the way. We're in the Mediterranean squadron. And it's not a bad day. William Waters fell from the main yard and broke both his legs and otherwise severely wounded him. Received 11 carpenters from the squadron to assist fitting up cabins for the reception of the Spanish ambassador. Opened cask of beef and pork. This was a very relatively ordinary day for the captain of HMS Ganymede. It was a dramatic and traumatic day for William Waters, a day that changed his life forever. He, as a quarter gunner, he was still expected to do rigging work. This may have been the outcome of a sail drill gone wrong. Certainly the Ganymede was to keep the sailors busy. The captain was doing lots of gun drill, lots of sail drill. It may have been a sudden squall blew up. There seems no record of that in the captain's log. However, it happened. William Waters was on the main yard and he came crashing down onto the oak deck of the Ganymede. Breaks both legs. One is clearly a compound fracture because as he's rushed to the surgeon, it's determined that one leg needs to be amputated in order to save his life. Waters is lucky; he has a really good surgeon, a man called Francis Delaney, who must have worked swiftly because Waters survives. He survives the amputation. And then the muster list record he was sent to Haslar Hospital to recover. So this archival trace then built up a picture for me of the rehabilitation processes, the sort of daily experiences of an ordinary sailor when they find themselves in Haslar, which was, you know, relatively state-of-the-art facility for the repair of a really important resource, the manpower. Benefited from 2 operating theatres and a large staff, and Waters is there for a considerable amount of time until he's deemed unserviceable. and he is sent out from Haslar, the gates closed behind him. And he has to find a solution to the problem of feeding himself and his family. Now his naval career is close to him. The records of his life after the Navy, after he leaves Haslar, showed me another window into this world, which is his family life and the family life of an ordinary sailor in this period. So Waters is lucky, he gets a pension, he's a quarter gunner, he gets a relatively good pension. It's still not enough to feed a family on London prices and London rents, but it's not bad. And there in the pension records, he turns up, William Waters, a black man, but not just him, because the very final pension instalment, a busy clerk makes a quick note to himself, final instalment paid to Elizabeth, widow. So suddenly there in the pension records, Billy Waters' wife steps into the story. And his song, Polly, Will You Marry Me, suddenly became to me, had a different resonance to me. Polly is almost as common a name for a sailor's lass as Jack is for the sailor. And there in the pension records is William Waters' Polly. The woman he refers to as Polly, actually, when the magistrates are trying to put him away because he's a nuisance, playing and begging on the street. And he says, he will live and die constant to Poll. A line that's taken from Charles Dibdin's popular sailor songs. A statement of Jack Tar's loyalty to Poll that echoes Jack Tar's loyalty to the nation. And there in those records at the National Archives is William Waters' Poll. Probably a white woman, statistically speaking, but could be a black woman or a mixed race woman, we don't know. But there we get a window onto a real diverse London. The area around here was full of immigrants, Italian, Irish, black, Jewish, and in Covent Garden and the Rookery of St Giles, the Waters family settled. That's where Waters went back to each night after he'd performed in the pub or in the street. That's where he raised his family, he and Elizabeth. And suddenly we get a window then onto the post-naval life and the challenges and struggles of maintaining a family on an inadequate pension and on the charity of Londoners. And there she is, Elizabeth, getting the last pension instalment. So my final point then, before I close. Here is the portrait of Billy Waters that's on the front of the book. Here he is. It hangs in the National Maritime Museum most of the time. Sometimes it's on loan. It's very small. It's well worth having a look next time you're in the National Maritime Museum. It's attributed to David Wilkie, but you know, one Wilkie expert said to me that's extremely unlikely. We don't even know if the date that this painting is given is accurate. But looking at it, we might think, there he is. There's the real man. There's William Waters, the man who left Haslar Hospital and had to find his own way. The man, he's not wearing a sailor jacket, sure, but there's the man who grew up in New York, who ended up in the Navy, who performed on the streets of London. There's the real guy, not Billy Waters, the fictionalized idea of him. But we might also look at this another way and say, well, hang on a minute, this portrait strips away all the things that Waters added. It strips away that cocked hat and its reference to the Pinkster festivals and the caricatures of Napoleon and officer dress. It strips away the sailor jacket and its echoes of Jack Tar and its claim for a place in British life. Strips away all of that, all of the things that Waters put together to represent himself, all the choices he made. And so when we go back to this image that I began, the first picture that I saw of Waters, there in his sailor jacket and his hat, with his wooden leg, playing, dancing in the pub. Yes, it's racialized and caricatured. Yes, it's stereotyped. But, in showing the details of costume that Waters himself chose to represent his multiple influences, perhaps the Cruikshank brothers, maybe without even knowing it, were depicting the circulation of the Black Atlantic and its multiple cultures, driven frequently by participation in daily life. They were depicting it right there, under their noses. Eventually, these investigations became the book, and one thing we're doing off the back of the book is a project called Songs from the Shadows, which brings together a graphic artist. I've already shown you some little examples of her work, and a musician and other researchers, and we're creating educational resources for schools that tell the story of Billy Waters' life and think about the history of empire and transatlanticism and maritime history through the lens of his life. And if you're interested in that project, there's a link up here. You can download free resources. Any school can download a free copy of the graphic novel, access the song for free. If you know any teachers, tell them about it, spread the word. It's free resources for their school. If you want to know more, you can get in touch with me. And I want to leave you with the song about Waters' life that Angeline Morrison wrote for our project, called Jump Billy. I thought I would finish there if I can. We had it open.
Yeah.
I'll let you do it.
You don't need an expensive solicitor to appoint you or potential.
We've introduced it, yeah.
Can we make it bigger?
Yeah, we can.
So this is, ooh, there it is, that one there. This is Jump Billy by Angeline Morrison and the Sorrow Songs Band.
Billy John's skating and he's spinning around. People for the people and they'll pay that money down. Jump Billy John's Billy, Billy, what you say? Jump Billy John's Billy, John's got a people and they'll pay that money down. Jump Billy John's Billy, Billy, what you say? People for the people for the John's got
There we go.
I once was an animal, until from the ship's I went.
People for the people and they'll pay that money down. Jump Billy John's Billy, Billy, what you say? People for the people and they'll pay that money.
Stand back and up. I mean,
And I will pause it there, but you can access the rest of the song on YouTube using that link if you wish. Thank you very much.
We're all sure that everything that's could be known, you know, otherwise it's in that book. But more than that, it's the window that it provides, isn't it? It's everything that it evokes, which is important and which can spark discussion and so forth. So it's a wonderful thing to take into schools, and it's a good thing to bring here. Any comments or questions? Yes.
I noticed you had a right amputation
Yeah.
and above you.
Yeah.
the Portrait in at Greenwich, but the others are left below knee.
Yeah.
And, why is that been depicted?
I think there's two possible answers to that. First of all, the provenance of the portrait is very dubious. I actually strongly suspect that portrait is not of Billy Waters at all. I think it's most likely of another black ex-sailor who also was well known on the streets of London, who we know only as the Old Commodore. And so that segues into answer number two, which is, I think on some level, Regency popular culture didn't really care which leg it was. That's partly because, you know, what was interesting for them about Waters was the performance, the associations, the kind of cultural ideas that he was connecting with, this reimagining of Jack Tar as a Black American, this bringing together of so many different musical influences, English folk, maritime jigs, African American rhythm, all of that. There was that, but also I think on a more sinister level, a kind of disregard for the specificities of Black bodies. So, you know, hey, this is somebody who's he's Black, he's disabled, he's probably an ex-sailor, right? They're obviously the same guy. Or if they're not really interested in that, we're just interested in the kind of representation of the big idea. So it's something about the kind of fungibility or the swappability of Black bodies, especially poor Black bodies, and especially disabled poor Black bodies, that's going on there. And also, yeah, also as perhaps more positively, a celebration of character over facts, an interest in the idea of Waters, the idea of somebody who lived beyond the pale of so-called respectable middle-class society, who represented an itinerant, carnivalesque, non-conventional life, and who represented the possibilities of a different kind of London living right under everyone's noses, and the attractions of that. I think it's all of those things. But good question. Thank you.
I'm going to say there's another one, isn't there?
Yeah.
And that's the printer's plate.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Exactly.
Print of the painted version, you often reverse it.
Exactly. But the intriguing thing is, some of the caricatures are one way, some of the other. So, you know, we're in the realm of confusion and possibility. But yeah, I think there's a lot of them. It is about the printing technique, absolutely as well. Yeah.
Was it to have broken both legs?
Yes. So one must have been a compound fracture, and the other one must have been a cleaner.
Simple.
Yeah, exactly. So fortunately for him, they only had to amputate one. Yeah.
How did you go about finding him in the historians?
Okay, so I found in the accounts in cheap fiction and in the popular press, there was a general story kicking around that he was a version of his life that he was an African prince who sold into slavery in Demerara and then ends up on the ship HMS Ganymede as a cook, and cowers in the hold whenever there's a battle and accidentally has his leg shot off. That's the story that's going around. So that version of Waters as the intelligent, experienced, recognized petty officer is turned into the caricature of the comic black ship's cook in the story. But the specificity of that ship name interested me. So essentially, I went hunting through the master records of HMS Ganymede, and once you get a rough sense of dates, once you get one thing, it leads to the next, as I'm sure you know. You can follow the chain, and then I just needed to find the record, to find the record of the accident. I had to kind of guesstimate where it would be in the captain's log, and just sort of zoom in on that part of the captain's log of HMS Ganymede. Because fortunately, HMS Ganymede is one of the ships where so many of the records survive. You've got the master's log, captain's log, the pension records, the pay book, but there's a lot of it. And that's not the case for every ship, of course. So that's more or less how I did it.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wonder whether, looking back about 50 years to mid-18th century.
Sure.
You'd read the work of a lovely black lady called Joan Animado, who was writing about 25 years ago, but her work for Greenwich Leisure Services was entitled Sugar, Spices and Human Cargo, Early Black History of Greenwich. And she managed to identify that, although the records are not very clear, but there were many black residents, particularly in areas like Deptford where the ships came in.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was a reference to the Lascelles family papers. They were West Indian sugar merchants and importing and had ships bringing stuff over to London and mooring at Deptford. And she died. She, I think, was the lovely lady who identified a letter for me, which described, the captain was sending, no, the owner of the ship was sending my Negro, and they use that language, to a doctor at Guy's Hospital for treatment.
Interesting, yeah.
Because he was thought to have the pox, and he went into the back ward, but in fact was subsequent letter then said he was discharged because in fact he had a cancerous ulcer.
Yeah.
But we don't know anything about him, unfortunately,
Yeah.
other than what's in the records of the Lascelles family.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Thank you. Yes, of course, that area of London is another place where you can go and find, if one is looking for something that one might identify as a black community in this period, then that's an area of London that a historian might be looking, as well as this area around St. Giles. Yeah, it's both. And another possible answer for how William Waters and the men he arrives on at the Nor at Sheerness with, how they all end up in the Navy. They may have been pressed by Tower Hill, so it may have been a question of sort of staggering out with one of these pubs and coming slap bang against the press gang. It's entirely possible that all of these men were already in London before they ever ended up on the guard ship. It's not possible to know, but yeah, you're quite right. Thank you.
I was, yes.
Gotta say, but this is I'm sorry about this, the way you talked about is being a cook on a ship, because that was a job that people who lost their legs could do on a ship.
Yes,
So he chose to leave the Navy rather than going to be a cook on a ship.
absolutely.
And the story that was told and reputed about him, that was something that people would have understood.
Yeah,
And the
absolutely.
fact that people did suffer post-traumatic stress when Cannon Fire was around, he wouldn't have been the only one who would have cowered in a conflict situation, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Could have been a cook, but he chose not to.
Yeah, for whatever reason, my suspicion that, this is pure speculation, but my suspicion is if you've had a relatively long maritime career by this point,
Yeah,
if
you're not
you've been,
35.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and if you've been a petty officer, do you really want to go and be a ship's cook and there are other options? When did he meet Elizabeth? Was that factoring into his decision to stay on land? Was she already pregnant? Was were the family imperatives there and different decisions being made? But yeah, absolutely, an awful lot of disabled sailors, black and white, became ship's cook, and it was something of a stereotype to have a black ship's cook. So So, you know, there are logical reasons why that popular account went for that version of him, but nevertheless, the ship's cook is stereotyped in caricature in popular culture as a comic figure. The ship's cook is never heroic. They are always funny. So in going for that as the version of water story that popular culture wanted to tell, it is erasing his skills and promotion, and it is establishing him within a particular stereotype and a particular viewpoint. Yes, that happened, but it's the way it's framed and how it would be understood that I think is interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, my observation would be that is pretty much what hack writers always do.
Yeah.
Throughout history.
Yeah.
You know, and they use stereotypes, and it's far easier than doing research.
Yep, much quicker, and also yeah, and it fits in a narrative that people recognise, right?
But I mean, an interesting, well, to me, an interesting reflection. He, as far as you know, he was in the Navy for less than 2 years.
Yeah.
In active service.
Yeah.
And he suffered a very nasty accident, which is, but it was an accident.
Mm-hmm.
If he'd been in the merchant service at the time, we should probably be more likely to have an accident because there'd been less men to man the rigging.
True enough.
And he'd have been damn lucky to get any kind of pension.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, this is the thing. I mean, the Navy was a good choice.
In that sense, if you're going to get busted up, do it in the Navy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, his treatment in Haswell was top notch. And you know, by reading between the lines of the accounts, they were working hard to get him back serviceable because that was the goal, right? That was the most useful outcome for everybody. And yes, he got fast attention. He got a good surgeon. And good pay and a decent pension, relatively speaking. I mean, as I say, not enough to survive London prices, but still a decent pension. So yes, the Navy was an excellent choice for any man in his situation. And of course, you know, in the British Navy, he's not going to be sold into enslavement back in America, which was a constant risk if you were a black sailor pushing into ports in the Americas. So there are many sound reasons for joining the Navy, and that's why I suspect he may, you know, how far he was pressed, how far as a volunteer. He is actually listed as vol in the
And that's, excuse me.
He wasn't pressed, otherwise it would have said he was a volunteer.
well.
He got King Shilling. He took a shilling.
Took a shilling doesn't mean that he didn't see the realities of the situation and think I better take the volunteer's bounty rather than resist.
Yeah, that's a good call.
It's a good call. I don't think it was stupid.
Yes, I mean, this is, but it's an interesting reflection about, as far as you know, from New York, that, as you said, about chances of being flowed back into, you know, from, you know, it may have been even had slave antecedents, but we don't know, of being sold back in slavery. There's a very good reason for a black in New York to want to get out of the country
100%.
and come to Europe.
Yep.
If not to Britain.
Yep.
Necessarily.
Absolutely. Very good reason to put to sea. Very good reason. Maritime work was a good choice, a very sensible choice for a young black man born in New York. And yeah, I mean, this is the person who was constantly making sensible, resilient choices with the circumstances that he had, and I don't think autism would have been unusual for that. I think what it does is it gives us a window into a world where ordinary people are busy trying to shape their lives as much as they can within the choices that they've got, just like we do today in many ways. And it shows us that on the ground kind of agency, contingency, challenge that would not have been exceptional for autism. So yeah, you're quite right.
I found myself wondering about the literature on black sailors that you're contributing to, because in a way you've got an advantage because you've got a subject who, you know, to historical figure and you can do the digging around, but you've also got a literary figure who can play off not just, you know, reconstructing your life, but reconstructing, you know, how black sailors are portrayed, thought about, and so on, so that's great. But what else is being done in terms of black sailors? Because I don't know anything, are other careers being traced, are there demographic studies, or where does this fit in with the current state of studies of black
That's a great question, thank you. Yeah, so there's growing interest in black sailors in the Napoleonic Navy in particular, but just generally. There's more evidence for later in the period, so there've been some really good studies of 19th century black history that includes sailors, but particularly there's Roy Salt's book, it's called Black Mariners, which goes all the way from the late 18th up to the early 20th century and thinks about changes over time and, access to officer status, family background, all that kind of thing. There's Black Tars, which is about particularly the American picture and the Americas more generally, and thinks, I can't remember who did that, it's an American historian. That's a really interesting book, Black Tars, which argues for an alternative map of black circumnavigation. So it says, well, yes, we've got the maps of the transatlantic slave trade, that's forced travel, that's forced migration, that's forced maritime experiences, but what about, can we do a different map which looks for unforced, choice-driven maritime journeys, that thinks about the sort of local fishermen making short trips around the Caribbean, which looks at not just deep water sailing, but other kinds of sailing that kind of redraws the map. So that's really interesting as well. Yeah.
The Marines.
Not so, oh, yes, there's a guy called, oh God, what's his name?
Go on.
What is his name? Josh, somebody, he's done lots of stuff on Marines and also black soldiers, ordinary black soldiers. Josh, somebody.
There's stuff about the later ones. I know about the colonial Marines,
Yeah,
but the early ones.
I don't know about Marines specifically, but this guy, whose name escapes me, has looked a lot at soldiers during the early period. And I would be surprised if he hasn't thought about Marines. I mean, they're a very specific type of soldier, obviously. There's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no book about Black Marines, but there are studies of Marines in this period which do mention Black Marines as part of the topic, but nobody's kind of looked at it in detail. It's like, it's starting to happen, I suppose, in lots of different ways. And I think there's only going to be more and more.
But is it fair to say from what you said, the summary, that the emphasis is on identifying like the scale and location and the participation rather than the sort of cultural angle that we take?
Yes, I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wanted to add in the cultural angle and think about how sailors generally and black sailors in particular are represented and what that tells us about their lives, the world in which they found themselves, and also the culture which is doing the representing, as well as the facts on the ground.
Right, I opened the chat rather than the questions, so we actually do have some online questions. I apologize. I haven't read them either. Is Billy Waters the same man who wore a model ship on his head?
Oh, great question. No, he's not, but they, I think they're really interesting figures to put together. So, Joseph Johnson is the man who wore a ship on his head. You may have heard of Joseph Johnson. He built a model of Trafalgar, of HMS Victory, and made money performing in London and also just outside London. By all accounts, it was a really compelling performance. He sang the song The Storm, which was a really popular maritime ballad, and he acted out the movement of the ship, and people said it was really convincing. You could imagine that the Victory was in a storm or, navigating the ocean in a battle. And he also acted out the actions of his pictures in there. who would act out the actions of, you know, hauling the rigging in the case of a storm or loading the guns. And people loved this, you know, he went around performing these little pieces, and I do think there's something about hats going on here. So Johnson's hat is very much, yes, it's a model of a ship. It's also very much in the Caribbean tradition of John Canoe, the John Canoe Festival. John Canoe was a black festival in the Caribbean, and there were dancers who wore model ships on their heads. And John Canoe was a moment of carnival freedom for enslaved people in the Caribbean. And I think there's something about the John Canoe extravagant hat tradition that's behind what Johnson was doing, but also behind what Billy Waters was doing. Hats for enslaved people in the Atlantic world mean power, mean a moment of freedom, mean a carnivalesque kind of energy, and mean performance. And if Waters learned anything as a child in New York, watching the Pinkston King perform, he learned performance was power, and performance was a moment where you could get all eyes on you, no matter who you were and what your background was and what your skin color was. So I think there's something very important about hats going on with Johnson and Waters. So thank you for that question.
The reason I grabbed your book was to help answer Sarah's question about whether you have any thoughts about fiddles, because you implied there's a whole chapter about fiddles, isn't there?
There is.
A whole section about fiddles. So I don't know if you want to give a breakdown, a summary, or if you want to invite Sarah to read that chapter for me.
Yes, please do read the chapter, the section on fiddles, Sarah. The book is organized by the parts of his costume, as I say, and runs through his life chronologically, but thinks about the cultural significance of these parts of his performance. And fiddle is an important part. The fiddle is that's his music, apart from his singing. So yeah, the fiddle is, you know, a great way to get a maritime job if you've got musical skills. An important way to establish your position on a ship, and a crucial way to create a melting pot of rhythms and music, to grab the attention of listeners on a busy London street when there are so many options for their attention. And it's also, a fiddle is loud, it's high pitched, it sings out above traffic and people and horses and baggage and clatter. So, you know, fiddle is an early amplification system. It's all those kind of things together, and the fiddle had all kinds of cultural meanings and implications in the period. So yeah, do you take a look at that, Sarah?
Excellent. And there's the other intervention from online is just to say that it was a really interesting talk and opening and inspiring, which I agree with. So I think that's a good note, actually, to maybe join in thanking you for.
Thank you.
Thank you to the people online.
And thank you for your questions.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.